The cul-de-sac on Renfield Court looked like a postcard the day everything fell apart. Sprinklers hissed in lazy arcs across green lawns trimmed to the same regulation height. American flags hung from identical white porches, and somewhere down the block a kid was practicing trumpet badly enough that even the birds seemed to be avoiding that yard. I'm Daniel Voss, 36 years old, an emergency trauma surgeon at Caldwell Memorial, and on that particular Saturday in July I was wearing swim trunks instead of scrubs for the first time in what felt like months. Holding a paper plate of potato salad I had no intention of eating, watching my pregnant wife Mara laugh at something our neighbor's kids said, while our daughter Lily sat at the shallow end of the community pool, her leg braces resting beside her like two patient metal sentinels. Lily was 7. She had cerebral palsy, diagnosed when she was 14 months old, the kind of diagnosis that rearranges a family's entire architecture overnight. She couldn't walk unassisted, couldn't always control the tremor in her hands when she was excited, and she got excited a lot, because despite everything, despite years of physical therapy and surgeries and braces that left red marks on her ankles, Lily was the happiest person I had ever met. She loved the water more than anything else in the world. In the pool, gravity loosened its grip on her, and for 30 or 40 minutes at a time, she could move the way other kids moved, freely, joyfully, without apology. That was the day Karen Whitfield decided that joy was a violation of the HOA bylaws. I should explain who Karen was, because by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly the kind of person we're dealing with, and exactly how badly she misjudged the family she'd chosen to terrorize. Karen Whitfield was 58 years old, twice divorced, and had appointed herself president of the Renfield Estates Homeowners Association 4 years earlier in what neighbors described, half joking and half terrified, as a bloodless coup. She wore visors even indoors. She carried a clipboard to a swimming pool. She had, in the 18 months we'd lived there, fined the Garcias for a basketball hoop that was aesthetically inconsistent, fined old Mr. Yannick for leaving his recycling bin out 4 hours past the posted retrieval window, and sent no fewer than 6 certified letters to a single mother 3 doors down because her son's bicycle had been left in the driveway overnight. Karen didn't enforce rules. Karen worshipped them, the way some people worship vengeful gods, and she expected the entire neighborhood to kneel beside her. Lily had a doctor's note, an official, laminated exemption, permitting her companion aid, a small flotation vest, in the community pool, because without it her legs simply couldn't keep her stable for more than a few seconds. The HOA's posted rule banned non-Coast Guard-approved flotation devices during open swim hours, a rule clearly designed to keep rowdy kids from clogging the pool with inflatable swans and noodles, not to target a disabled child's medical equipment. We had submitted the exemption in writing 8 months earlier. Karen had signed for it herself. She brought it up anyway, the moment she saw Lily in the water. "That vest needs to come off," Karen said, materializing at the pool's edge with the particular speed of a woman who had been waiting all summer for an excuse. Her voice carried, it was built to carry, trained over years of community board meetings to flatten every other conversation in the room. "Pool rules are pool rules, Mrs. Voss. I don't care whose daughter she is." Mara, 8 months pregnant, set down her lemonade with the careful patience of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in her head a dozen times already that summer. "Karen, we've been over this. Lily has a medical exemption. You signed off on it in November." "I don't recall signing anything," Karen said, which was a lie so transparent that 2 other mothers sitting nearby actually looked up from their phones. "It's in the HOA file. I can show you the email thread right now." Mara had her phone in hand before she even finished the sentence. 8 months pregnant and still moving like a woman who handled chaos for a living, because she did. Mara managed intake at a children's clinic and had spent a decade absorbing exactly this kind of bureaucratic cruelty on behalf of other people's kids. This time, it was aimed at her own. "I don't need to see an email. I need that vest off my pool," Karen snapped, and something in her voice had changed. Gone thin and sharp, the way ice does right before it splits. She stepped toward the water's edge, toward Lily, who had gone very still, the particular stillness of a child who has learned that adults raising their voices means something bad is about to happen to her. "Don't," Mara said, and there was nothing soft in it now. She moved between Karen and the pool's edge, between Karen and our daughter, the way mothers have moved between danger and their children since the beginning of time, 8 months of pregnancy be damned. Don't you dare go near her. What happened next took 11 seconds. I know because the neighbor's pool camera, the one mounted under the eave of the Henderson's patio umbrella, caught all of it, time-stamped, and 11 seconds was enough to change 6 lives forever. Karen grabbed Mara's wrist to push past her, to get to Lily, to rip a flotation vest off a disabled 7-year-old in front of 40 witnesses. And Mara, instinctively, pulled back. Karen's grip migrated, whether out of rage or panic or some toxic alchemy of both. Her hand found Mara's throat and squeezed, shoving my 8 months pregnant wife backward into the pool deck's metal railing hard enough that her head cracked against it before she went down. I was 40 feet away, talking to another father about grilling techniques, useless small talk that I will never forgive myself for, when I heard the scream. Not Mara's, Lily's. A 7-year-old scream has a frequency that cuts through every other sound at a pool party, and I was moving before my brain had even processed what I was running toward. I got there in time to see Karen's hand still locked around my wife's throat, Mara's face going the particular dusky color I had seen 1,000 times in trauma bays, a color that means seconds, not minutes, and I did something I have never done outside of a hospital. I put my entire trauma training into motion in someone's backyard, peeling Karen's fingers off my wife's windpipe one at a time while shouting at the nearest bystander to call 911. Then immediately rolling Mara onto her side, checking her airway, checking her pupils, feeling for the baby's movement against her belly with a hand that was not, for once in my professional life, steady. Karen stood there. She did not apologize. She did not look afraid. She looked, instead, mildly inconvenienced, the way she might look at a sprinkler head that had sprayed water onto her shoes. She shouldn't have put her hands on me, Karen said, to no one, to everyone, brushing imaginary dust off her sleeve. I have witnesses. I was defending myself. I looked up at her then, my hands still on my wife's throat, my daughter's screams still echoing off the privacy fences, and I said the only thing I could manage. You don't know who you just did this to. She didn't. Not yet. Karen Whitfield had no idea that the man kneeling on the pool deck in swim trunks, checking his wife's carotid pulse with 2 fingers and counting silently under his breath, was the same surgeon who would, in less than 90 minutes, be standing over an operating table making decisions that would determine whether another family's nightmare ended in relief or grief. She had no idea that I had spent 14 years training my hands to stay perfectly calm in exactly the kind of moment she had just created. She had no idea that the hospital where I worked, the very hospital the ambulance would be racing toward, kept detailed incident logs that trauma surgeons document everything, that I would spend that night not just treating my wife but quietly, meticulously building a case file in my head with the same precision I used to map out a bleed. The ambulance arrived 9 minutes later. Mara was conscious by then, terrified, one hand locked around her belly, croaking out the words, "The baby. Is the baby okay?" over and over while the paramedics fitted a cervical collar around her bruised throat as a precaution. Lily was sobbing in the lifeguard's arms, her flotation vest still on, because in all the chaos nobody had thought to take it off. The single object Karen Whitfield had assaulted a pregnant woman over, still bobbing uselessly against my daughter's small chest while the woman who'd caused all of it stood at the edge of the pool deck, arms crossed, already rehearsing her version of events for whichever board member she planned to call first. I rode in the ambulance with my wife. I held her hand the entire way, monitoring her pulse with my fingers because some habits don't turn off just because you're terrified, and somewhere around the 2nd mile I made a decision that would shape the next 90 days of our lives. I was not going to let this go. Not the assault. Not the lie Karen was already constructing. Not the casual cruelty toward a disabled child that had somehow become so normalized in that neighborhood that 40 adults had stood by a pool and watched it happen without a single one of them stepping in before I got there. What none of us knew yet. Not Karen, not the board, not even Mara as she lay on that gurney gasping out half-formed words about our unborn son, was that the hospital Mara was being rushed to, Caldwell Memorial, was the same hospital where I would be paged exactly 83 minutes later for an entirely unrelated trauma case. A case that would, through a coincidence so strange that even now I have trouble believing it happened exactly the way it did, place Karen Whitfield's own family directly under my hands, asking me, no, begging me, to save the life of someone she loved. I didn't know that yet. I only knew that my wife was bruised and terrified in the back of an ambulance, that my daughter was sobbing into a lifeguard's shoulder 40 feet from a woman who felt no remorse, and that somewhere inside me, Underneath the panic, a colder and more methodical part of my mind had already begun keeping score. Karen Whitfield was about to learn what happens when you assault the wrong family in front of the wrong witness, on the wrong afternoon. In the one town in America where the man holding your fate in his hands had spent 14 years learning never to let his hands shake. Caldwell Memorial's emergency bay was controlled chaos when we arrived. The particular rhythm I'd built my entire career around. Gurneys rolling, monitors beeping their urgent two-tone alarm. Residents calling vitals across the room, except this time I wasn't the one giving orders. I was the husband standing helplessly in the hallway while Dr. Priya Anand, my colleague and friend of 9 years, examined my wife behind a curtain I wasn't allowed past because hospital policy doesn't bend for staff, even staff whose wives are the patients. Strangulation injuries are tricky, Priya told me afterward, pulling me aside with the gentle bluntness doctors use on other doctors, because we both knew sugarcoating wastes time. There's petechiae in both eyes, bruising consistent with manual compression, and her trachea took a hit when she went into the railing. I want her on monitoring overnight. The baby's heart rate dipped during transport, but it stabilized. For now, we're not out of the woods. Any additional stress, any spike in her cortisol or blood pressure, and we could be looking at preterm labor at 33 weeks. 33 weeks. Our son wasn't due for another 7. I stood in that hallway and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still. The same stillness I used in the OR when a case went bad and panic became a luxury I couldn't afford. Lily sat in a plastic chair nearby, her braces back on, clutching a hospital teddy bear someone from Child Life had given her, asking me every 4 minutes if Mommy was going to be okay, and every 4 minutes I told her yes because it was the only acceptable answer, true or not. Then my pager went off. I want you to understand what that pager meant in my life. 14 years as a trauma surgeon teaches you that the device clipped to your waistband doesn't care what's happening in the rest of your world. It doesn't care that your wife is on a monitor 2 floors up with bruises shaped like fingers around her throat. It doesn't care that your 7-year-old daughter is asking you, for the 40th time, whether her mother is dying. When that pager sounds, there is a body somewhere in this building that is actively losing the fight to stay alive, and you are, for reasons that have everything to do with training and nothing to do with fairness, one of a tiny handful of people in the entire region capable of intervening. Trauma 1, multi-vehicle MVA inbound, ETA 4 minutes, possible aortic involvement. The page read. I looked at Priya. She read my face before I said a word. Go, she said. I've got Mara. I've got Lily. Go save whoever needs saving, Daniel. That's who you are. I scrubbed in with my hands literally trembling for the first time in 11 years of trauma surgery, forcing them still through sheer discipline. The same discipline that had let me peel Karen Whitfield's fingers off my wife's throat without crushing the woman's hand in the process, though God knows some animal part of me had wanted to. The patient arrived 4 minutes later. A man in his early 60s, multiple fractures, suspected internal bleeding, blood pressure crashing despite fluids. We moved him into the OR within 6 minutes of arrival, which in trauma surgery is close to a record, and I went to work doing the thing I trained half my life to do. Finding the source of catastrophic internal bleeding before a human being ran out of time. It was a torn splenic artery, worse than the scans had suggested, and for the next 90 minutes I did not think about Karen Whitfield, did not think about my wife's bruised throat or my daughter's crying or the certified letters Karen had threatened to send our HOA board about Mara's aggressive behavior. I thought about clamp placement and bleeding control and the particular, almost sacred focus required to keep someone's heart beating when their body has decided it would rather stop. We stabilized him. We saved him. It's the part of my job that, even after everything that's happened in my career, still feels like the closest thing to a miracle I've ever been allowed to participate in. It wasn't until I was peeling off my gloves, exhausted, drenched in sweat, that a nurse named Beatrice caught my arm in the scrub hallway with an expression I'd come to recognize over the years. The look that meant something complicated was waiting for me. Dr. Voss, she said carefully. The patient's family is here. His daughter's been asking to speak to the surgeon. She says. Beatrice hesitated, glancing at a clipboard. She says her name is Karen Whitfield. I want to be honest with you about what happened inside me in that moment because this is the part of the story people always say they don't believe, the part that sounds like something out of a screenwriter's fever dream rather than real life, except it happened exactly this way, and I have the hospital records, the consent forms, and 6 witnesses who can confirm every word. The man I had just spent 90 minutes pulling back from the edge of death. The man whose torn splenic artery I had repaired with my own hands while my wife sat bruised 2 floors above us, was Karen Whitfield's father, Harold Whitfield, 71 years old, T-boned at an intersection 3 miles from Renfield Estates less than 2 hours after his daughter had strangled my pregnant wife at a pool party. I stood in that hallway for a long moment, gown still untied, mask hanging around my neck, processing the kind of coincidence that doesn't happen in normal life but happens, somehow, in trauma medicine more often than statistics would predict, because tragedy in a small enough radius tends to braid itself together in ways that feel almost engineered by some cruel, ironic god. Then I walked out to the family waiting area, and there she was. Karen Whitfield, visor finally gone. Mascara streaked down both cheeks, looking nothing like the woman who had stood at a pool's edge 2 hours earlier announcing she had witnesses to her own innocence. She was pacing, phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip, and when she saw me, saw my face, recognized it instantly despite the surgical cap and mask marks still pressed into my skin. Every drop of blood seemed to leave her face at once. "You?" she breathed. "Mrs. Whitfield," I said, and I want you to understand that I said it the way I say it to every family, with the same clinical calm, because that calm is not a performance, it is a discipline, and in that moment it was the only thing standing between me and saying something I could never take back. "Your father sustained a torn splenic artery and multiple rib fractures in the collision. We were able to repair the artery and control the bleeding. He's critical but stable. The next 48 hours will tell us more." She stared at me. I watched her mind try and fail to process the geometry of what was happening, that the surgeon holding her father's survival in his hands, the surgeon she now needed to trust completely, was the husband of the woman she had strangled at a pool deck less than 2 hours earlier. Will he? She couldn't finish the sentence. Her hands were shaking now, the same hands that had wrapped around my wife's throat with such cold, casual entitlement. "I did everything within my ability to give him the best possible chance," I said, and that was true, every word of it, because that is who I am. Not because I owed Karen Whitfield a single ounce of mercy, but because Harold Whitfield owed me nothing, had done nothing, and the oath I took 14 years ago doesn't have an exception clause for the relatives of people who hurt my family. "I'd like to discuss his post-op care plan with you, whenever you're ready." "Why are you being?" she started, then stopped, looking at me with something between confusion and dawning horror, as if my professionalism in that moment was somehow more unsettling than rage would have been. Rage she could have understood. Rage she could have justified to herself, turned into another grievance for another certified letter. A man treating her father with complete competence and care directly after she had nearly killed his wife, broke something in her logic that she didn't have a framework for. "Because your father is my patient," I said simply. "What happens between you and my wife is a separate matter, and it will be handled through the proper channels. All of them." I left her standing there in the family waiting area, because I had post-op orders to write and a daughter upstairs asking when her mother could come home, but I want you to sit with the image of that moment the way I have sat with it every day since. Karen Whitfield, the woman who terrorized a disabled 7-year-old and assaulted a pregnant mother for the crime of protecting her, standing alone in a hospital hallway, suddenly, completely dependent on the mercy and skill of the one man in that entire building who had every reason in the world to walk away and didn't. That's the part Karen never understood about people like me. Mercy isn't weakness. Professional integrity isn't forgiveness. I could save her father's life and still make absolutely certain that what she did to my family followed her for the rest of hers. Those two things were never in conflict, and over the following 3 days, as Harold Whitfield's condition stabilized and Mara's bruises began their long, ugly transformation from purple to green to yellow, I began building something Karen Whitfield never saw coming. A case, constructed with the same surgical precision I brought to every operating table, that would dismantle her position in that HOA, her reputation in that neighborhood, and ultimately, her freedom, piece by methodical piece. Because here's what Karen didn't know yet. Standing in that hallway with her father's life in my hands, the Henderson's pool camera hadn't just caught the assault. It had caught audio too. And buried in that audio, 11 seconds before her hand closed around my wife's throat, was something Karen Whitfield had said under her breath that would later become the single most damning piece of evidence in the entire case against her. 5 words that proved, beyond any possible doubt, that this hadn't been an accident, a misunderstanding, or self-defense. It had been premeditated, and the recording proved it. The 5 words on the Henderson security footage were these: "I'm done asking nicely." Karen Whitfield said them under her breath, half a second before she shoved Mara backward into that railing, and the detective who eventually reviewed the footage, a quiet, methodical woman named Sergeant Ruiz from the county's domestic violence unit, told me later that those 5 words changed everything about how the DA's office would charge the case. Not a moment of panic. Not a reflexive overreaction. A decision, spoken aloud, by a woman who had already made up her mind to put her hands on a pregnant stranger before she ever did it. I didn't go to the police that first night. I want to be honest about that, because the version of the story where the righteous husband marches into the precinct within hours, evidence in hand, demanding justice, isn't quite how it happened. What happened instead was 3 days of triage, my wife in observation for placental abruption risk, my daughter needing constant reassurance, Harold Whitfield, ironically, recovering steadily under my own surgical team's care 2 floors below my wife's room, and somewhere in the gaps between all of it I started gathering everything I could find. I requested the Hendersons' footage the morning after the incident. They gave it to me without hesitation, horrified by what they'd witnessed and grateful someone was finally documenting Karen's pattern of behavior instead of just complaining about her at book club. I pulled every email in our HOA correspondence thread referencing Lily's medical exemption, 11 months of them, including the one where Karen had explicitly written in her own hand, "Approved exemption on file," before turning around and claiming at poolside that she'd never seen it. I found, through a neighborhood Facebook group that exploded within 48 hours of the incident, for other families with stories disturbingly similar to ours. Not assault, not yet, but the same pattern of targeting, the same fixation on rules selectively enforced against the people Karen had decided, for whatever twisted internal calculus governed her, deserved less consideration than everyone else. A single father whose son had ADHD and occasionally ran across lawns during meltdowns. An elderly widow whose home health aides car had been ticketed 11 times for parking at an unapproved angle. A young couple, both wheelchair users, whose accessible parking modification had been challenged by Karen personally at 3 separate board meetings, despite full legal compliance. What I was building wasn't just a criminal case. It was a pattern of conduct file, the kind that transforms a single ugly incident at a pool party into something a prosecutor can present to a jury as calculated, repeated, willful cruelty rather than an isolated lapse in judgment. Mara, once she was stable enough to engage, became the file's fiercest architect. 8 months pregnant, throat still bruised, she sat up in that hospital bed with her laptop and organized every document into a folder she labeled, with the dark humor that had gotten her through a decade in pediatric intake, Karen's greatest hits. She wasn't doing it for revenge, not really, though I won't pretend some part of both of us didn't want exactly that. She was doing it because Lily had asked her, that first night home from the hospital, a question that neither of us has ever fully recovered from. "Mommy, was it because of me? Because of my vest?" That question is the reason this story exists. That question is the reason I'm telling it to you now, months later, with the legal proceedings behind us and a healthy baby boy asleep down the hall. Because no 7-year-old should ever have to wonder if her own medical equipment, the one thing in the world that lets her feel free in the water, was the reason her pregnant mother nearly died in front of her. Sergeant Ruiz took the case seriously from the first meeting, which surprised me, because I'd heard enough stories from colleagues about strangulation cases being downgraded, dismissed, treated as domestic squabbles, even when the victims weren't romantic partners at all. But strangulation, Ruiz explained to us in a small interview room 3 days after the assault, is one of the strongest predictors of future lethal violence in any offender's history, a statistic she'd memorized cold, the way I'd memorized surgical protocols. Someone who strangles once, she said, is geometrically more likely to escalate to homicide than almost any other category of violent offender. We don't treat this lightly. Not anymore. The footage, the documented exemption, the premeditated phrase caught on audio, and the pattern of conduct file from 4 other families combined into a case strong enough that the district attorney's office filed felony charges within 2 weeks. Aggravated assault, with a hate-motivated enhancement given the explicit targeting of Lily's disability accommodation, a legal classification that elevated potential sentencing significantly. Karen Whitfield, who had spent 4 years ruling Renfield Estates from a folding chair at HOA meetings with the absolute conviction of a woman who believed rules existed exclusively to be wielded against other people, suddenly found herself on the other side of an enforcement mechanism for the first time in her adult life, and the irony was not lost on a single person in that neighborhood. The HOA board, faced with mounting pressure from no fewer than 6 families threatening to file their own formal complaints, voted unanimously to remove Karen from the presidency within 19 days of the incident, the fastest leadership turnover in the community's recorded history, according to the property manager who'd been there since the development broke ground. Her replacement, a soft-spoken accountant named Felix Marrow who had, notably, never fined a single person in 3 years on the board, immediately rewrote the flotation device policy to explicitly and permanently exempt all ADA-documented medical equipment, a policy change the board named, almost as a quiet rebuke, the Lily Voss Amendment. But the legal case was where the real reckoning unfolded, and it didn't move quickly because justice rarely does. There were continuances. There were defense motions to suppress the audio recording, all denied. There was a deposition in which Karen Whitfield, under oath, claimed she had felt physically threatened by an 8 months pregnant woman standing still with her hands at her sides, a claim so transparently absurd that even her own attorney reportedly winced on the record. There was, throughout all of it, the surreal undercurrent of Harold Whitfield, Karen's father, recovering steadily under my team's continued post-surgical monitoring, occasionally asking the nursing staff with visible discomfort how the other situation with his daughter was progressing, a question none of us were in any position to answer for him. I visited Harold twice during his recovery purely as his surgeon, checking his incision sites and reviewing his labs, and on the second visit, 3 weeks after his surgery, he said something to me I've thought about often since. He was a quiet, courtly man, nothing like his daughter in temperament, and he looked at me with the particular shame of a parent confronting his child's worst self in public for the first time. "I don't know what happened to her," he said, staring at the ceiling tiles rather than at me. "She wasn't raised this way. Somewhere along the way she decided that being right mattered more than being kind, and I don't know how to forgive myself for not stopping it sooner." He paused, then added quieter, "Thank you for saving my life anyway. I know you didn't owe her that. I know what she did." I told him what I believed then and still believe now, that his daughter's actions were entirely her own, that nothing he could have done excused them, and that the surgery had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with the fact that medicine, real medicine, doesn't get to pick and choose whose life is worth saving based on what their relatives did 3 hours earlier in a swimming pool. The trial date was set for late autumn, and 4 days before it began, with the evidence stacked against her so completely that even her own legal team was reportedly urging a plea deal, Karen Whitfield made one final move that nobody, not Ruiz, not the DA, not Mara, not even me, saw coming. A move that would either be remembered as the most calculated act of desperation in the entire case, or the first genuinely human thing she'd done since the moment her hand closed around my wife's throat. She showed up, unannounced, at our front door. It was a Tuesday evening, for days before trial, and I remember the specific quality of the light because it's the kind of detail that imprints itself permanently when something significant is about to happen. That low amber August light that makes everything look slightly unreal, slightly staged. Mara was in the kitchen feeding our son, Theo, who had arrived 6 weeks earlier, 3 weeks premature but healthy, 7 pounds of furious, red-faced proof that the worst day of our lives hadn't won. Lily was on the living room floor doing the leg stretches her physical therapist had assigned, the same exercises she'd been doing the very morning of the pool party, when the doorbell rang. I opened it expecting a delivery. Instead, Karen Whitfield stood on our porch, alone, no visor this time, no clipboard, wearing clothes that looked slightly too big for her, as though she'd lost weight she didn't have to spare. She looked, for the first time since I'd known her, like an ordinary, frightened, 58-year-old woman instead of the self-appointed sovereign of Renfield Estates. "Please," she said before I could speak. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Every instinct I had, every protective reflex built over the previous 4 months, told me to close the door. But Mara appeared behind me, Theo on her shoulder, and said the words that, looking back, I think defined the kind of family we were determined to remain through all of this. Let her say what she came to say, with witnesses, on our terms. We didn't let her inside. We stood on the porch, the 4 of us, Mara, Lily peering curiously around the doorframe, Theo asleep against his mother's chest, and Karen, standing on the welcome mat she had once cited for being an unapproved shade of blue, began to cry in a way that, for the first time in this entire saga, didn't look performed. "I'm not here to ask you to drop the charges," she said, her voice cracking. "My lawyer would kill me for saying that out loud, probably. I'm here because 4 days from now I'm going to stand in a courtroom and the whole neighborhood, my father, everyone, is going to hear exactly what I did, in detail, and I needed to say this to your faces first instead of hiding behind an attorney." She looked at Lily, and something in her expression genuinely buckled. "I am so sorry, not because I got caught, because I looked at a little girl who just wanted to swim, and instead of seeing a child, I saw a rule I needed to enforce. I don't know when I became a person who does that. I don't know how to undo it. But I needed you to know that I know exactly what I am now, and it's taken almost killing someone to see it." Lily, who had been listening from the doorway with the unfiltered directness that 7-year-olds bring to moments adults spend their whole lives tiptoeing around, spoke before either Mara or I could respond. "Are you going to tell other kids not to be scared of their braces?" she asked. "Because some kids think their braces make grown-ups mad at them. That's not true. You should tell people that's not true." Karen looked at my daughter for a long moment, and something in her face cracked open completely. "Yes," she said. "I'll tell them. I promise. I won't pretend that conversation resolved anything legally, or that it should have." Sincere remorse, arriving 4 days before trial, after months of fighting the case through her attorneys, doesn't erase what happened on that pool deck, and it didn't erase it in court either. The trial proceeded as scheduled. The footage played. The audio of those 5 words, "I'm done asking nicely," was entered into evidence and, according to 2 jurors who spoke to local press afterward, was the single piece of evidence that ended any debate in the deliberation room. Mara testified, calmly, devastatingly, describing 11 seconds that had nearly taken her life and her unborn sons in front of her 7-year-old daughter. I testified about the injuries in clinical surgical detail, the kind no defense attorney could meaningfully challenge, because I wasn't speaking as a grieving husband on that stand. I was speaking as the trauma surgeon who had examined the bruising pattern with the same rigor I'd bring to any patient chart. Karen Whitfield was convicted on the aggravated assault charge with the hate-motivated enhancement and sentenced to 4 years, with the possibility of parole after 18 months contingent on completion of an anger management and disability awareness program the judge specifically mandated. A sentence the judge explained, reading from prepared remarks, was meant to reflect both the severity of premeditated violence against a vulnerable and pregnant victim and the genuine, documented remorse Karen had shown in the lead-up to trial, remorse that, while it changed nothing about guilt, mattered for what came after. Harold Whitfield visited his daughter every week she was incarcerated. He sent us a card on Theo's first birthday, unprompted, unexpected, simply thanking us, again, for things that had nothing to do with each other and everything to do with the strange, braided way our 2 families had become permanently entangled in the space of a single July afternoon. Renfield Estates is a different place now. The Lily Voss Amendment still governs the pool's flotation policy. Felix Marrow, the new HOA president, instituted a mandatory disability awareness training for all board members, something that would have been unthinkable under Karen's reign. For other families who'd quietly endured years of selective enforcement finally felt safe enough to speak up, and 3 of them have since had their own complaints formally resolved in their favor. Lily still swims every Saturday. Her vest, the one Karen tried to rip off her in front of 40 witnesses, sits on the same pool deck now without a single person questioning it. She's 9 now, stronger, more confident, and last spring she told her physical therapist, completely unprompted, that she wants to be a doctor when she grows up, like Daddy, but for kids who are scared of the water. Theo is too loud, fearless, utterly unaware that his entrance into this world happened in the shadow of the worst 11 seconds his family ever lived through. And me, I went back to work 3 days after that pool party because that's what trauma surgeons do, because somewhere in that hospital there was always another body on the table needing steady hands and a clear head, no matter what chaos was unfolding in my personal life. But I carry something different into every operating room now, a clarity I didn't fully have before that July afternoon. That the people who walk through those doors, the families I save and the families I can't, don't get to choose whether they deserve my best effort based on what they've done to deserve otherwise. Harold Whitfield taught me that lesson in the cruelest possible way, by being the father of the woman who nearly killed my wife, and needing my hands to save his life less than 2 hours later. Justice, in the end, didn't look like rage. It didn't look like refusing to operate or screaming in a hospital hallway, or letting Karen Whitfield's father bleed out on a table while some primal, understandable part of me whispered that he deserved whatever he got because of what his daughter had done. Justice looked like doing my job with total integrity even when every cell in my body had a reason not to, and then, once that job was finished, building a case so thorough, so methodical, so undeniable, that the system designed to protect people like Lily and Mara finally, for once, actually worked. Karen Whitfield is eligible for parole next spring. Whether she walks out of that facility a changed woman or simply a punished one, I can't say. But I know this: my daughter swims free now, without fear, without a clipboard-wielding stranger deciding her medical equipment is a violation of some arbitrary rule. My wife is alive, my son is healthy, and somewhere in a prison 300 miles from here, a woman who once believed rules existed only to be weaponized against people she decided mattered less is finally, for the first time in her life, learning what it feels like to live inside consequences she can't appeal, can't find her way out of, and can't simply overrule from a folding chair. That's the story. 11 seconds at a pool party. A coincidence in a hospital hallway that no screenwriter could have invented. And a family that came out the other side broken in places, but together and finally completely safe.